Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 275, The Problem of the Case-Book. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you know, the problem with you, Burt, you're going to hear from me tonight.
Good. It's high time.
You know, when we look at all of the stories in the canon, there's only one problem, and that's Thor Bridge. We'll find others, though, I'm sure.
Well, if there is a problem associated with Thor Bridge, the only kind of problem I can think of, Scott, is one that is unsettling.
Inside joke there. Well, this is episode 275 of Trifles. 275. Wow. That's like one of those anniversary numbers or something. That means in another, I'm not good at math, 17 episodes? We'll be up to 300. No.
Yeah, you really aren't very good at that.
No, I'm sorry. In another 25 episodes, we'll be up to episode 221. No, wait a minute. I've done that wrong again. In another 25 episodes, we'll be up to 300. Love it. Well, if you'd like to get the show notes for this episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles275, all lowercase. Will take you directly to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. You can poke around there and see what we have to offer. And of course, you can offer us something in return, like your undying support as a Patreon supporter. We've recently welcomed new people aboard, and I know there's new listeners out there who are catching up on all of our old episodes. So welcome, welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're part of the community. And just a reminder that if you are a Patreon supporter, you are automatically entered into a drawing every month and every quarter for, respectively, a Baker Street Journal back issue and a year's subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So you'll want to check that out. And finally, if you want to get in touch with us for any reason, please do so at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. All right. Well, this is where we introduce the concept here. This, of course, is one of those episodes that we call Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist, where we look at a piece of old Sherlockian scholarship. Perhaps it's a piece of scholarship that you can't get your hands on quite so easily anymore. This one comes from, I found it in The Grand Game, Volume 1, which is sold out from the BSI Press. However, this particular entry in the Grand Game is taken from the Sherlock Holmes Journal, Volume 1, Number 3. And I believe the Sherlock Holmes Journal is available on electronic copy, is it not?
I do have a copy of the electronic Sherlock Holmes Journal, and I believe it's still available. And if anyone is interested and is having trouble finding it, just send us an email and we'll connect you.
Yeah, there you go. And we'll, if we can, we'll have a link to it in the show notes. And this particular article from the Sherlock Holmes Journal is called The Problem of the Case-Book, and it's by D. Martin Dakin, whom you may remember. I'm not sure if we talked about Dakin here previously. He's a Sherlockian scholar, a British Holmesian scholar, I should say, or Holmesian scholar, who wrote a Sherlock Holmes commentary in the early 1970s. He lived from 1908 to 1979 and was present at the first meeting of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London in the summer of 1951. And according to another great British Sherlockian scholar, James Edward Holroyd, who remembered him in the Sherlock Holmes Journal, Dakin was a retired schoolmaster and brought exceptionally wide knowledge of the saga to his frequent contributions to Society of London discussions. His Sherlock Holmes commentary, published in 1972, gave him a worthy place among major chronologists. Its comprehensive range of closely reasoned conclusions also makes it an indispensable guide to the canon. Wow, those are really supportive words for a man of our ilk.
High praise indeed.
Indeed. Well, why don't we kick off the problem of the Case-Book? Exactly what's the problem here, Bert?
Well, there are quite a number of problems, but just before we do that quickly, I just wanted to mention two things. One is that our friend Bruce Harris has written a book about, actually, D. Martin Dakin's Sherlock Holmes commentary, correcting, amplifying, exploring some of the points that Dakin has made, which is really, really interesting commentary about the commentary. And the second thing is, this article, this essay by D. Martin Dakin, 1953, Volume 1, Number 3 of the Sherlock Holmes Journal, as you said. The other authors in this issue included Gavin Brand, who had 2 articles, S.C. Roberts, and James E. Holroyd. So this is really from the golden age. This is still, at least in my view, the golden age of Sherlockian commentary. And in this essay, The Problem of the Case-Book, Dakin gets us right to it. And it has to do with one word, the authenticity. You know, the stories, some of the stories in the Case-Book just don't ring true. And so Dakin immediately kicks off and says, look, in the first place, we have 3 stories which do not even purport to be by Watson. And 2 of them, now he's talking about the Blanched Soldier and the Lion's Mane, are supposedly from Holmes's own pen. But did he really write them? And by the way, says Dakin, everything we know about Holmes is that he was critical of Watson's attempt at popular stories. So is it really credible he would have tried to do something like this himself? And even if he did, could he have found nothing better, even among all the cases unknown to Watson, than these 2, for example, undistinguished adventures, which don't even display his capabilities to any advantage? And here Dakin is talking about the Blanched Soldier and the Lion's Mane. And so he says, you know, I have to conclude as an example. Now, we're just right into this essay, that these 2 are that's easy for me to say, pseudonymous stories.
Pseudonymous? Is that?
Yeah, it's sort of like
pseudonymity.
Pseudonymity.
I'm going to sue you over the pronunciation of this, Bert.
I've been sued, ominously. Ominously, I've been sued. Possibly written up from facts supplied by Holmes to the author, whoever that is. But more likely, these things are pure inventions. And then he says, you know, if you were at the 1951 exhibition saluting Sherlock Holmes here in London, you'd be aware, as an example, of the scientific difficulties connected with the description given of Siena capillata, you know, the lion's mane. And also, Holmes compares his mind. Holmes says, my mind is like an attic stored with an unsystematic mass of out-of-the-way information. Well, that's in complete contradiction to what we know about him from A Study in Scarlet. So Just starting out here, the Blanched Soldier and the Lion's Mane, I don't think they passed the test. He says, I think these are fictitious.
This is interesting. I'm going to pick a bone with Dakin and his conclusion here, because he talks about the narrative style, which is really what we have to go on here. Holmes is purporting to have written these to himself. And, as a guy who just wants to get to the facts, you wouldn't think that he'd be a great storyteller. But he says, and if it can be argued that we have no other means of telling what Holmes was like as a writer, I reply that we have. In the Gloria Scott and the Musgrave Ritual, he writes, we have what are, in effect, two cases related by himself, not to speak of shorter accounts and past exploits given to Watson in stories like The Final Problem and The Empty House, and they show Holmes as an excellent storyteller, lucid, powerful, and clear in every detail. The Blanched Soldier and the Lion's Mane come out poorly by comparison. And, okay, that may be so, Mr. Dakin. However, could it not be that Holmes was a terrible storyteller, and Watson simply wouldn't let terrible storytelling get in the way of his telling a good story, so he buffed it up a little bit before it headed to the publisher?
Well, sure, and that's why those two stories, the Final Problem and The Empty House, are obviously completely Watsonian. Yeah, I very much agree with you. Now, the interesting thing here, among many interesting things here, is that as we go on, he's put a stake in the ground here, rejecting these two stories, just starting out from the Case-Book, The Blanched Soldier and the Lion's Mane, as fictitious. But he says, if we reject The Blanched Soldier as fictitious, with it goes all the evidence for the much-discussed second marriage of Watson. And there's really, he says, no reason to suppose Dr. Watson was not always devoted to the memory of his first love. Why, this whole reference to the second Mrs. Watson is probably the mistake of a misguided writer who wanted to account for Holmes writing the story himself and didn't have the wit to realize the marriage belonged to an earlier period.
Jeez. Well, and for anyone who attends BSI weekend, the second Mrs. Watson is one of the toasts that we give at the dinner. I mean, we're going to have to rethink our entire schedule, our entire agenda.
Yeah, our entire definition of the Holmesian and Watson universe.
Right.
Yeah. Well, then he goes on and says, the other confessedly non-Watsonian story, The Mazarin Stone, is written in the third person, and it bristles with improbabilities. The unlikelihood of a record for the barcarolle for solo violin. And hopefully in a future interview on our other podcast, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, we'll be getting into that. And he picks other details apart. Dakin says, how could anybody know the initial detail of this conversation between Count Sylvius and Sam Merton unless Holmes had his ear to the keyhole from the moment he put the record on? And he finds fault with the facetiousness of Holmes's conversation with the Count. But his most compelling observation is, is it conceivable that so astute a planner as Holmes would rely for his success on the off chance that the two criminals would not be looking in his direction when he displaced the dummy and would not notice any sound that he might make?
I could almost picture Michael Caine in that role. It should be no surprise that Martin Dakin concludes that these three stories are spurious. And he said with them must certainly go The Three Gables. And this is a generally horrible story. He says, as it bears Watson's name, I can't believe that he wrote it. The plot's fantastic and improbable. And it's likely that any real man would bear the name. Is it likely that any real man would bear the name of Langdale Pike? But the chief argument against the case is the poor figure Holmes cuts in it. Never has a feebler story insulted the memory of the great detective. In his final scene, telling the fair Isadora Klein coldly that her fate is sealed, He gives in to her and lets her off with the contribution of £5,000. And then there's the roguish badinage of his exchanges with Susan. Oh, Susan, language! And goodbye, Susan. Paregoric is the stuff. Is even more embarrassing than his remarks to Count Silvius. And that strongly suggests that the same author, who seems to have been determined to show us Holmes as a funny man. But the falsest note of all is struck at the cheap jeers at Steve Dixie. And this is interesting. Remember, Dakin is writing in the 1950s, and even to recognize the overt racism happening there at the expense of Steve Dixie, it was really terribly egregious on the storyteller's part.
It was, and Dakin expresses it really well. He's written a lovely sentence here. Dakin writes, Holmes was a gentleman, and one thing no gentleman does is to taunt another man for his racial characteristics.
Well, on that note, let's taunt our sponsors for just a moment.
Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today.
Well, we left off at Holmes the Ungentlemanly Gentleman, and that brings us to the problem of Thor Bridge.
Yes, but this is a great turning point in Martin Dakin's essay, because he says, well, now, while we must decisively reject these stories, there are others in the collection that bear just as clearly the stamp of authenticity. And Thor Bridge is one. The plot and the style are excellent. In every line, it has the marks of a Watson reminiscence. And Dakin singles out the conversation with Neil Gibson. Holmes at his best, he says. You know, Holmes has inquired about the real relationship that Neil Gibson has had with the governess. And Gibson replies, I suppose you are within your right, maybe doing your duty in asking such a question, Mr. Holmes. And then Holmes says, we will agree to suppose so. Meaning, says Gibson, that I lie. And Holmes says, well, I was trying to express it as delicately as I could, but if you insist upon the word, I will not contradict you. And Dakin says, now what could be finer than that? And he's right. Great. It's a lovely Holmesian interchange.
It is the perfect interchange. Just one of those that stands out. Dakin doesn't spend a lot of time on the three Garrett-Ebbs, but he does say it's a story told in Watson's best manner. And of course, this is the supreme moment in the Doctor's life when Killer Evans' bullet was the means of revealing to him the depth of Holmes's devotion to him. And that makes that story all the more worthwhile.
Yes, and in even a more accelerated fashion, Dakin passes over the Sussex vampire. He says, well, we should probably be safe in adding the Sussex vampire to our list of real Watsonian stories. And then he says, having dealt with these cases, we're now left with 5. Now, again, we're talking here about the Case-Book. So Dakin has taken us through this whole series of short stories. He says, the Veiled Lodger is in all probability genuine. And he has an interesting reason. He says Holmes' own part in it is so unsensational that there could be no good reason for inventing it. But he says, you know, his advice to Mrs. Ronder to keep her hands off her life. Shows him at his best as a good man as well as a good detective. And that's, he says, very reminiscent of his treatment of James Ryder at the end of The Blue Carbuncle. So the whole thing, he says, but above all, he says, there's this unmistakable thumbprint of Watsonian authorship because there's this passage at the beginning with the dark hints of the unpublished cases, including the story about the politician, the lighthouse, and the train cormorant. So this is probably a real story. And then he's back into critical mode. He says, the creeping man, on the other hand, I don't know. I regard, he says, with some suspicion.
Yeah, he says it's reminiscent of Dr. Jekyll or the werewolf than a Sherlock Holmes case. And this transparent device of referring to Camford University as a mashup of Oxford and Cambridge is a trick of a second-rate writer. Because, of course, we had already been to Cambridge to Cambridge for the missing three-quarter and Oxford for the three students. So, and Professor Presbury said read like a rather feeble imitation of that with the redoubtable Leslie Armstrong in Cambridge, that from where Holmes and Watson were notably ejected.
Yeah, well, now we're in the home stretch here, and Dakin goes on and says, now, of the illustrious client, it's more difficult to speak with confidence, but and he has some reasons here, gets into it, but he says, I'm inclined to think the story as a whole is by Watson, but that the editor of the series has added paragraphs at the beginning and the end, and maybe the title as well, to exaggerate its importance. I mean, for example, is this really the supreme moment of my friend's career, as Watson says? And that leaves us with two cases, which are the most difficult of all. He says, I should be inclined to accept Shoscombe Old Place as genuine, as there seems to be no particular reason for doubting it. The retired colorman, more doubtful. It's rather loosely constructed. And by the way, Mr. Bell, now that's H.W. Bell, has pointed out that in 1895, and the period from 1895 to 1899, Holmes could never have referred to, quote, this man's mentality, close quote. Dakin says, I've confirmed this from the Oxford Dictionary. So apparently the term mentality in those years at the end of the 19th century was not commonly in use or in use at all.
Maybe it was an editing error. Maybe he actually meant this man's sentimentality. That could be in that case. Yeah. Well, Dakin then kind of wraps it up saying, what's the result of our investigations? I suggest we're driven to the conclusion that some anonymous writer came into possession of a few of Watson's unpublished stories, like Thorbridge and the Three Garridebs.
And probably Sussex Vampire, Veiled Lodger, and Shoscombe Old Place, and the main body of the illustrious client, together with rough notes on others.
Yeah, and probably the Mazarin Stone and Retired Colorman. And finding they were insufficient for another book, decided to supplement them by inventing others of his own. 2 in the name of Watson, The Creeping Man, and the Three Garridebs, and 2 for a lark in that of Holmes, in addition to writing up the notes. Well, who this author may have been, of course, we do not know. It's Dakin says it remains a mystery worthy of Holmes himself. The only candidate I'm acquainted with so far is the second Mrs. Watson, whom I am obliged to reject, as I believe there's no such person. But I advance a theory which at least has the merit of novelty, and suggests that Watson's literary agent, having this material in his possession and desiring to complete another book, had the temerity to try his hand at writing some of these stories himself. Ha!
And he closes by saying, I do not know how far my conclusions will commend themselves to my fellow members of the Sherlock Holmes Society, but any comments and criticisms from them would be very welcome.
Well, what a lot of fun. To me, it's wonderful to go back to some of these original pieces of scholarship and get ourselves in the heads of these scholars when not a lot of field had been plowed at this point. It was virgin territory, as it were. And I think Martin Dakin did a fine job with his analysis of the case book.
But even more so, it shows you, and I hope that our listeners are getting some of the fun in these conversations out of the how-to of it, the how-to construct to participate in the great game and to dig in, and even on subjects that have been looked at before. There's always something new, some new twist, something you can relate to in your personal experience. Believe me, there's always a subject that comes up that nobody has explored. And that, believe me, is not a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What are you going to do?
To smoke. It is quite a three-pipe problem, and I beg that you won't speak to me for 50 minutes.